The squad car's door slammed shut, echoing through the quieted street. Marcus sat in the back, breathing deeply, feeling the cold steel of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. His mind raced, cycling through disbelief, anger, and fear. Yet he forced himself to stay calm. He knew he had to keep his wits about him, but it was hard not to let his imagination run wild with the consequences of this moment. As the car started moving, he looked out the window, seeing faces in the crowd that had gathered, some concerned, others angry, but all silent as he was driven away. In the front seat, Haynes and Bell exchanged a glance, both avoiding Marcus's eyes in the rearview mirror. The silence inside the car was oppressive, charged with an intensity that neither officer seemed willing to address. Suddenly, Marcus noticed his phone still buzzing in his jacket pocket, a message likely from his mother, wondering about dinner. He knew she'd worry if he didn't show up. His mother was never one to miss a beat, especially when it came to her only son. His stomach churned at the thought of her finding out he'd been arrested. Not for anything he'd done, but simply for who he was, where he was, and, he suspected, the color of his skin. Outside, the scene left in their wake was anything but calm. The crowd that had formed was growing, an undercurrent of tension filling the street. People murmured to one another, shaking their heads in disapproval. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier, her face lined with worry, turned to the young man beside her. "I've seen him here every morning. He's a nice young man, polite, always smiling," she said, her voice trembling. What could he possibly have done? The young man, still holding his phone up as if expecting another officer to show up, looked down at her and nodded. "This isn't right," he muttered, scrolling through the recording he had just captured. The video showed Marcus complying fully, never raising his voice, simply asking questions. It's not how it's supposed to work. He didn't do anything. The woman watched the footage over his shoulder, shaking her head. "It feels like something out of those stories we hear about on the news." Her voice cracked, sadness giving way to anger. She raised her hand, waving toward the people around her. "Are we just going to let them get away with this?" she called out, her voice carrying above the murmurs. "This young man has done nothing wrong." Her words seemed to spark something in the crowd, fueling a collective frustration that had simmered under the surface. Voices rose, some calling out for justice, others demanding answers. A few people began dialing friends and family, telling them to come to the scene, to witness what had happened. Within minutes, the energy on the street transformed. People held up their phones, capturing every detail, while a few local activists and community leaders began to arrive, drawn by calls about another unjust arrest. As the crowd grew, more officers arrived at the scene, trying to disperse the onlookers. But the tension was already set. Frustration bubbled over into shouts and raised fists as people refused to leave without an explanation. A local news van pulled up, and a reporter stepped out, microphone in hand, preparing to cover what was rapidly escalating into a scene of public outrage. Meanwhile, in the police car, Marcus was aware of none of this. He sat quietly in the back seat, trying to steel himself for what was to come. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him to stay calm, to stay respectful, to keep his emotions in check no matter what. Back at the precinct, the usual hum of activity faded as Marcus was led through the station in handcuffs. The air inside was dense with stale coffee and paperwork, contrasting sharply with the freshness of the morning he'd left behind. Officers looked up, some with a flash of curiosity, others with indifference. Detective Haynes kept a tight grip on Marcus's arm as they passed the booking area, where a few officers exchanged hushed whispers and knowing glances. They rarely saw a suspect in such crisp attire and with such calm, collected composure. "Name," barked the desk officer, not bothering to look up from the glowing computer screen in front of him. "Marcus King," Haynes replied, before Marcus could open his mouth. His voice carried an edge that Marcus hadn't noticed before, as if this were personal. The desk officer's fingers tapped away, entering Marcus's information. Without looking up, he nodded toward the fingerprinting station. Over there. Marcus moved as instructed, feeling the cold, indifferent efficiency of the station around him. He complied with each command, knowing that any resistance, however slight, could be twisted and used against him. But every motion felt surreal, as though he were watching himself from outside his own body. As they led him toward the holding cells, Marcus caught sight of a young officer observing the scene, his brow furrowed with what appeared to be unease. Officer Grant had only been on the force a few months, and he watched the situation unfold with quiet discomfort, sensing something wasn't right. He had seen the kind of suspects that usually came through these doors, and Marcus didn't fit the pattern. There was no aggression, no evasive movements, just a calm man in a well-tailored suit with steady eyes and an air of restraint. As Marcus was escorted to the cell, Officer Grant felt an urge to speak up, to question the situation, but his senior officer's hardened expressions held him back. He knew he had little say here. Marcus was placed in a dimly lit cell at the far end of the hallway. The metal door clanged shut behind him, echoing off the concrete walls, sealing him in solitude. He sat on the narrow, cold bench, trying to push down the rising tide of frustration and humiliation. Forcing himself to stay calm, he focused on his breathing, replaying the morning's events over and over, searching for a single misstep. But there was none. He had done nothing to deserve this. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd had swelled significantly. What had begun as a small group of curious onlookers had transformed into a gathering of community members, activists, and even journalists. News of Marcus's arrest had spread quickly, with calls and messages circulating through social media, urging more people to come to the station and demand answers. Mrs. Grant, the elderly woman who had witnessed Marcus's arrest, stood at the front of the crowd, her face etched with a fierce determination. She held a hastily made cardboard sign that read, "Justice for Marcus." Her voice, once gentle, had become sharp with indignation as she recounted what she had seen to anyone who would listen. "He did nothing wrong," she cried to the gathered crowd. "He was just trying to go to his car. This is not how our city should treat its people." The young man who had recorded the incident, Sam, had already uploaded the footage online. Within minutes, the video was circulating across the internet, accumulating thousands of views. People watched in outrage as Marcus complied with every request, answering questions calmly, only to be forcibly restrained and led away without any apparent cause. "This isn't right," Sam said, speaking into the camera of a local reporter who had arrived to cover the scene. "They saw a black man in a nice suit, in the wrong neighborhood, and they assumed the worst. This is what happens every day, and it needs to stop." The chants began soon after, echoing through the neighborhood with increasing fervor. "Justice for Marcus." "Enough is enough." "Hold the police accountable." The crowd's voices grew louder, a powerful, united chorus that shook the precinct walls. Inside, the officers exchanged wary glances, the tension thickening as they realized the scale of what was happening outside. The station hadn't anticipated such a fierce response, and as more people gathered, they began to sense the full weight of the public's outrage. Back in his cell, Marcus could faintly hear the chants, their rhythm like a heartbeat echoing through the concrete walls. He straightened his back, his resolve hardening. He realized that this wasn't just about him. The crowd outside wasn't simply calling for his release. They were standing up against something far bigger, a fight that had been waiting to erupt for too long. And as he sat there, hands still cuffed, his heart swelling with equal parts anger and hope, Marcus knew this moment would mark the beginning of something he couldn't yet fully understand. Outside the precinct, the crowd had surged into a force of undeniable presence, voices rising and banners waving as people demanded justice. The air buzzed with anger, thick and unyielding. Some held signs with phrases like, "Justice for Marcus," and "End racial profiling," while others recorded videos, live streaming to their followers as they chanted for accountability. The tension in the crowd had reached a boiling point, fueled by years of pent-up frustration, and it was clear that this moment, this fight, had grown far beyond just Marcus King. Inside, Lieutenant Kate Monroe watched from a window, her jaw clenched as she took in the size and intensity of the gathering outside. She hadn't been on the scene when Marcus was arrested, but she had heard murmurs about him. A sharp, young consultant dedicated to helping underserved neighborhoods. And now, Monroe found herself questioning how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. She knew they had made a mistake, but it was too late to turn back. They were facing a storm of public outrage that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. With a sigh, Monroe turned away from the window and walked down the corridor to where Officers Haynes and Bell stood, looking tense and avoiding each other's gaze. She approached them, her voice sharp. "What exactly were you thinking?" Monroe demanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked from one officer to the other. Haynes straightened, his face set in defensive lines. "We were following protocol, Lieutenant. He matched the description." Monroe cut him off with a look that could slice through steel. "Protocol? I don't recall any protocol about targeting a man in a suit, on his way to work, and throwing him into cuffs because he matched a description." Her voice was cold, measured, each word an accusation. Bell shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we had a gut feeling. He was in a nice car, in an area that's had some issues." "A gut feeling?" Monroe's voice was incredulous. "You two just put this department in the middle of a nightmare because of a gut feeling?" Haynes, bristling with indignation, opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the sound of raised voices filtered through the halls. The crowd had grown restless, their chants louder and more insistent, shaking the foundation of the precinct itself. The weight of Monroe's anger seemed to settle heavily on the two officers. They could feel the ramifications of their actions bearing down, more real and immediate with every passing second. Monroe took a deep breath, reining in her frustration. "Look outside, both of you," she said, gesturing toward the window. "You see that? Those people aren't just here for Marcus King. They're here because they're tired. Tired of stories like this. Tired of being told it'll change while nothing does." Haynes and Bell exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Monroe straightened, her mind racing through options. There was only one way to handle this without letting it spiral into chaos. "I'm going to speak with him," she said, her tone resolute. "And I'll be the one deciding how we proceed from here." She left the officers standing there, too stunned to protest, and walked briskly toward the holding cells. Monroe's own frustration simmered beneath the surface. She was a woman who had spent her career doing things by the book, navigating a system that was anything but straightforward. And now, standing before Marcus's cell, she felt the weight of that flawed system bearing down on both of them. Taking a steadying breath, she unlocked the cell and stepped inside. Marcus looked up, his gaze steady, calm, even in the dim, sterile light of the cell. His hands were still cuffed, but his posture was poised, his dignity unbroken. "Mr. King," she began, her voice carefully measured. "I'm Lieutenant Kate Monroe. I'd like to discuss what happened." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm all ears, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice calm but laced with a controlled intensity. "Though I'd prefer to hear it without these cuffs on." Monroe hesitated but realized the importance of extending this gesture. She moved forward, unlocking the cuffs and setting them aside, watching as Marcus rolled his wrists, wincing slightly from the chafing. "Thank you," he said, his gaze holding hers steadily, filled with both patience and a restrained anger. "Mr. King, I understand why you're upset," Monroe started, though even she knew the words sounded hollow. "This shouldn't have happened, and I'm here to get to the bottom of it." Marcus let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You want to know what happened? I'll tell you what happened," he replied, his voice rising slightly. Two officers saw me in a suit, in a nice car, in the wrong neighborhood. That's all it took. He leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. Do you have any idea how many times this has happened to me? To people like me? Monroe was silent, absorbing the anger that pulsed through every word. She nodded, acknowledging what he was saying, recognizing the truth that underpinned his frustration. I can't change what happened, she admitted, her voice softer. But I can make sure this is addressed, and I can take responsibility for it. Marcus's jaw tightened. Responsibility? Lieutenant, it's not just about responsibility. It's about accountability. The community outside, they're here because they know how these things end. Quiet apologies, empty promises, while everything stays the same. Monroe looked away, feeling the weight of his words like a blow to the chest. She had spent years in this department, working within its limits, telling herself she was making a difference. But in this moment, standing before Marcus, she felt the weight of her own complicity. I understand, she said quietly. I can't undo the past, Mr. King, but I'll do everything in my power to make sure this is handled properly. Marcus took a deep breath, seeming to rein in his frustration. Lieutenant, this isn't just about me, he said, his tone calmer but still firm. The crowd outside. They're out there because they see me in here and they know I could be anyone, any one of their sons, brothers, fathers. They're out there because they're tired of this story playing on repeat. Monroe nodded, and for a moment, they shared a heavy silence, one that conveyed an unspoken understanding of the stakes at hand. I'll be out there shortly, she promised, a spark of determination in her eyes. I'm going to speak to the crowd. They deserve to hear what happened, and they deserve more than empty promises. Marcus watched her carefully, noting the shift in her tone, the resolve that seemed to settle over her like armor. Then make it count, Lieutenant, he said, a glint of hope mingled with doubt. Because if you don't, this will only be the beginning. As Monroe turned to leave, she felt the weight of his words settle into her very core. This wasn't just about saving face. It was about acknowledging a broken system and stepping into the storm that awaited her outside. Walking toward the front of the station, she steeled herself, feeling the charged energy from the crowd, hearing their chants for justice reverberate through the precinct. She stepped out onto the steps, her gaze meeting the sea of faces, each one demanding more than just words. They were demanding a reckoning, a break from the patterns of the past. And as Monroe took a deep breath, she knew this would be one of the hardest moments of her career, a moment that would test her own convictions, and perhaps a moment that would change the course of the precinct and her life forever. Lieutenant Kate Monroe stepped out onto the front steps of the precinct, facing the surging sea of people. The crowd had swelled, stretching down the block and filling the street, their chants for justice reverberating through the air. Banners with phrases like, "Stop the injustice," and "We demand accountability," waved above the heads of people from every walk of life. Students, parents, community leaders, and strangers drawn together by the rallying cry for something to change. Monroe's heart pounded as she faced the people, her throat tight with the weight of the moment. She could feel their eyes fixed on her, a mixture of skepticism, anger, and impatience. Cameras flashed and phones were raised, capturing every second of this tense standoff. At the forefront of the crowd, Mrs. Grant, the elderly woman who had witnessed Marcus's arrest, held her makeshift sign high, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. Monroe raised her hands, calling for silence, and the noise slowly subsided to a low murmur. She cleared her throat, choosing her words carefully, knowing that they had to be more than just a string of hollow promises. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying over the restless crowd. "My name is Lieutenant Kate Monroe, and I understand that you're here because you want answers. You want justice. A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd, a low murmur rising in response to her words. She continued, feeling the weight of their eyes on her, each gaze holding her accountable. Earlier today, Marcus King was arrested by officers Haynes and Bell based on what they deemed a suspicion, Monroe said, her voice steady but laced with regret. However, after reviewing the situation, it's clear that his arrest was unjust and deeply flawed. There was no cause, no evidence, only assumptions that should have never been made. A wave of disapproval spread through the crowd, voices rising in anger, fingers pointing toward the precinct as if it embodied every injustice they had endured. Monroe's grip on the podium tightened. She knew she had to go further, that only acknowledging the wrong wasn't enough. Today's events reflect a deeper issue within our department, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. It is one that goes beyond one arrest, beyond two officers. It's a system that, in moments like this, fails to uphold the fairness it was meant to protect. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Monroe's apology hung in the air, a brief silence falling over the crowd as her words settled in. But then, from somewhere in the middle of the throng, a voice called out, clear and defiant. "We don't want apologies. We want change." The words struck a chord, and soon, more voices joined in, echoing the sentiment. Enough with the words. Where's the accountability? Make this mean something. Monroe swallowed hard, but her resolve only deepened. She took a deep breath, holding her head high as she prepared to give them what they demanded. You're absolutely right, she responded, nodding. Apologies are not enough. We need action. Effective immediately, Officers Haynes and Bell are being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into their actions. Their conduct will be reviewed in detail, and they will be held accountable to the full extent of the law. A surge of murmurs rippled through the crowd, voices quieting as Monroe's words hit home. She could see people exchanging looks of cautious hope, feeling the shift, the first signs of a long-awaited change. But Monroe wasn't finished. In addition to this, I am committing to bringing about deeper reforms within our department. We will work directly with community leaders, activists, and legal representatives to ensure that incidents like this do not happen again. I know that trust cannot be restored overnight, but we will take every step necessary to rebuild that trust, one day at a time. The crowd stood silent, stunned by her words. Monroe could see the skepticism still lingering on many faces, and she understood why. They had heard promises before, seen officials make speeches with the right words, only to watch them fade into empty gestures. This time, they wanted proof. As if in answer to their doubt, Marcus King himself stepped out from the precinct doors, standing beside Monroe. His presence seemed to send a jolt through the crowd, a tangible reminder of the injustice that had sparked this uprising. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. He turned to face the crowd, his gaze scanning the faces he recognized. Mrs. Grant, the young man with the dog, the activists and neighbors who had stood up for him when he had been powerless. "I don't want this to end with me," Marcus continued, his voice steady but resonating with conviction. "What happened to me today is something many people in this community have faced. It's not just about this arrest. It's about a pattern, a system that doesn't serve everyone equally. And we can't afford to let this go unanswered." He paused, looking over the crowd with a mix of gratitude and determination. "The fight doesn't end here. We have to hold this department accountable, and we have to hold ourselves accountable. Real change will only come if we stand together, if we demand it at every turn." The crowd, silent until then, erupted into applause, cheers echoing across the street as Marcus's words ignited something within them. Monroe, standing beside him, felt the weight of his words settle over her, a stark reminder of the work that lay ahead. Marcus looked at Monroe, nodding as if in silent agreement. This was just the beginning, a long, difficult road that would demand more than promises, more than speeches. And as they stood together on the steps of the precinct, facing the crowd that had become a movement, they both knew they were about to embark on a journey that could reshape the community, the department, and perhaps even the city. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy, the spark they had ignited, would remain. As Monroe watched them go, she could feel the gravity of what had just begun, a reckoning that wouldn't fade, a determination to forge a new path that would hold them all accountable. And with Marcus by her side, Monroe knew that they had just taken the first steps of a movement that was only beginning to find its voice. In the days and weeks that followed, the unjust arrest of Marcus King sparked a powerful wave of solidarity and action. The community, once quiet and disillusioned, came together with renewed strength and resolve. People from all walks of life joined public forums, community meetings, and open discussions, voicing their demands for change. Community leaders, activists, and even those who had once stayed silent were now united in their call for justice. Under the guidance of Lieutenant Kate Monroe, the police department initiated a series of deep reforms. Officers attended regular, intensive training sessions on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Monroe invited Marcus as an advisor to share his perspective, helping the police team understand the real impact of their actions and the importance of change. Inspired by these developments, Marcus decided to establish the Community Justice Initiative, a foundation offering free legal support to underserved community members and creating educational programs on civic rights. Every week, Marcus, Monroe, and community leaders met, not only to assess the progress of these reforms, but also to listen to the voices of the people, ensuring that promises were met with meaningful actions. This journey was far from easy. The department and the community faced countless challenges along the way, but little by little, positive changes emerged. Unity, trust, and hope began to flourish with every community forum and each new program. Marcus saw himself not just as someone who endured injustice, but as an inspiration and a symbol of the power of community when people stand together for what's right. Marcus King's story is a powerful reminder of the strength of justice, unity, and the power of a community that stands for change. If this story moved you, if you believe in equality and justice, please consider subscribing to our channel, Inspiring Hearts. Subscribe now so you don't miss more heartfelt stories about resilience, hope, and the fight for justice. Every subscription, every share helps spread the message of unity and compassion, reaching more hearts around the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey toward a better, more just world.